Let's take a look at Chris Williamson's podcast where Rory Sutherland expounds on his opinion of Gary Stevenson and some of the actual valuable insights that this guy progresses.
And that sort of messaging that's happening in. What do you make of Gary Stevenson's ascendancy and that sort of messaging that's happening in the UK?
Well, first, a frivolous point, which is if you want to help with wealth redistribution, Gary, go out and spend some fucking money, right? I mean,
hilarious, but reasonable. Although that being said, if I had money all the time, I would not spend it on anything because I just don't have any consumerism in my bones.
He was earning like £2 or £3 million a year and only earning one pair of shoes, okay? And his mates from school were working in JD Sports. And I couldn't help thinking, reading the book, Gary, just go down to JD Sports and just buy a few pairs of shoes, help out your mates, okay?
Are people from JD Sports working on commission?
A hot tub, but his fundamental insight, unbelievably stingy. Do you not think? Reading that book?
I haven't read it. I've seen him talk on.
But geez, Gary, just go out and, enjoy it for crying out loud. Okay, I think you get that weird thing, actually, in banking, which is so much of your enjoyment stuff back then was covered by an entertainment budget, okay, that you got really, really resentful about spending your own money.
This is an interesting point, and it does seem to be the case because whenever, the last video that we saw with Gary Stevenson from Lad Bible Stories, where they asked him, why do you dress like that? Aren't you trying to be professional? He gets a little huffy. He gets a little like, what? This is just normal stuff. I can't be bothered wearing a suit and this kind of stuff. So I think he might actually be onto something here.
You see what I mean? Most of us, the money comes in, 80% of it walks straight out again because we piss it up the wall. You know,
Very true.
I haven't got an air fryer for the second bedroom, But there are people who kind of, if you're in that very corporate world where more or less all your fun is taken care of by some expense account, you actually find spending your money disproportionately painful. He's absolutely right in his insight that money is becoming unhealthily concentrated. In the two things I would say, he's absolutely right that economics uses these single representative agent models, which don't capture inequality.
Very true. Like GDP line goes up. Does that matter? It can, but it's not necessarily a good indicator of whether or not, people are actually living better lives economically.
Okay. I would argue personally, Gary, that you need to read up a bit about Georgism, which I think the great ideas of Henry George and the land value tax would actually take care of a lot of that. In my view, if you tax land ownership, because property ownership is effectively you are buying the right to impose taxes on the younger generation. So when people invested in gold, okay, it doesn't do anybody else any harm because I can make do without any gold. Okay, I'm not massively into bling, not hugely into jewelry. Okay, we can all get by without gold. If there's a bloody a Dutch tulip boom, okay, I'll just switch to gladioli. Okay, but I can't substitute for property at some level. If your employer demands you work in a major city, okay, and land and commutable land is scarce, other than the blimp, of course, where you could just live tethered above Berkeley Square, 400 feet up, okay, other than your blimp solution, there's no escaping the depredations of rent-seeking landowners. And what has happened is that we've sanctified wealth and been pretty mean on income. Okay, so we've taxed away income discrepancies pretty energetically, but they aren't that big. Okay,
yeah.
I mean, what I mean by that is, if you look at income inequality, even before tax, never mind corrected after tax, the number of people who earn 20 times median income, okay, they exist. But there are very few of them, and they pay an enormous amount of income tax. I mean, huge amounts of income tax. In other words, that's someone who's probably like a high-end lawyer in a partnership in, a London Magic Circle law firm. Now, there are a lot of people I'd rather the money went to than people in law firms, but nonetheless, those people pay a lot of tax, whatever you think about it, okay? By contrast, wealth inequality is monumental. I mean, there are people who, if they walked into a football stadium, every single person on average in that stadium would now be a multimillionaire simply because Bill Gates walked in. Okay, there aren't inequalities like that of that kind of extreme form in actual earned income, and
Mm.
yet we have this incredibly aggressive system of redistributing earned wealth, and yet we treat wealth that's actually resident in asset values and things as completely sacrosanct. And the
Mm.
problem is, until you actually get to that point where you start actually taxing. Now, Texas does it, amusingly.
Mm. Now, again, some of this is pushing into the realm of asset taxing, which is just a general sort of wealth tax. I don't think those make a lot of sense. I don't, especially if you're like, okay, hey, like I've got all of my money tied up in this company. And I put all my money into Tesla stock. I put all my money into Bitcoin or something like that. Bitcoin's maybe a little bit weird because it's like a currency, but I invested in my company. That's where the most, you know, wealthy people have all of their assets tied up in. It's where most of their stuff is in specific companies. Okay, trying to tax that specifically probably does not make as much sense and is not hitting the same issue because with that company, if you're investing in it and it grows, then more people can invest in it and more people can, get a piece of that. That company's valuation is, potentially infinite as opposed to land. Like the supply of the shares of any one company are potentially infinite as opposed to the supply of land or property and these things. You can make more property to a degree, but there's all kinds of roadblocks to making more of it that are like way more pragmatically difficult to overcome than like, making more stock shares for a certain company. And obviously land specifically, they're not making any more, right? So those things are much more finite and they're a little bit different than, stock options like that Bill Gates has.
Because you have quite heavy land taxes. So ironically, what's often stereotyped, I think, unfairly as, the most conservative state in the Union, which in fact is not, okay, but, as a highly conservative state, you actually pay quite a lot of tax on the value of the property you own. So the property taxes in Texas, I think around 2.5% if you own it. Now, the great effect that has is that it makes property less expensive because you have to pay tax on it, and it prevents you using property as an extractive store of wealth. Okay? And the extent to which I think you have to argue that speculation in property has been absolutely has led to enormous redistribution of wealth effectively to the not necessarily very deserving old at the expense of the hardworking young is, I just find it impossible to dispute. Okay. I'm 59, by the way. I did okay. I surfed the wave. I didn't surf it very well. I now own, a couple of flats. I don't own a house, nothing blingy. Okay. I now own a couple of flats sort of outright. But there are people who bought a house in 1974 whose children, this is literally a case I know of, okay? So there's a woman living on her own in a 5-bedroom house not far from where I live, which is probably worth, with the garden, 4.5 million, okay, or 3.2 or something like that. She has no money to spend. Okay? I mean, she has all this money tied up in a totally illiquid form of wealth. So, she's kind of going down Lidl and comparing the price of lemons, even though she owns a fuck off 3.5. Her children are kind of worried about how they replace the shock absorbers on their car. And then the argument would be, why should those children go out and work really hard? What I do, to be absolutely honest, is get into debt, go off to Barbados and wait for your mum to die. Right?
Fuck me.
No,
Yeah.
but nothing.
And the thing is like that's a legitimate actual like plan. Like that's a pragmatic doing an index of reality and going, yeah, I can work my ass off for, all this kind of stuff. Everything gets more expensive because of inflation. I'm getting taxed out the ass. And what do I do with that? So like, why should I work for that? If I've got, all of these assets tied up. Well, the reason why you have to do that is because your parents are going to blow it. Your parents are probably, especially if you got boomer parents or something like that, they're just going to piss it away. They're not necessarily doing things with your or even their best financial interests in mind because they are of a generation that's just way more consumerist and therefore they want to consume and buy shit. It makes them feel better.
You do working, let's say, as a school teacher. So there's this great book you must get her on called The Inheritocracy
Okay.
by a woman called Eliza. Oh God, I'll remember it in a
You're
second.
becoming increasingly left-wing here, Rory.
No. I'm pretty right-wing in terms of people's earnings because you have actually earned them.
Right.
So Henry George, effectively, the way to understand Henry.
And I will say about Gary Stevenson, he says the same thing. Now, he doesn't say it well. He does not put this forward very clearly or succinctly. And I think the reason for that is his goal, certainly in my mind, is to gather as much power and influence as possible. He's doing it through YouTube. And therefore, he's doing the thing that everybody does, which is, clickbait. He's being very hyperbolic. He's saying things in the most inflammatory ways possible. So Jeff Bezos is going to eat your kids if you don't tax the rich. Tax the rich, tax the rich, tax the rich. When you actually get into his actual policy recommendations, if he gives any actual indication for this, he'll say stuff very similar to this, which is no, I don't actually want to tax people that are making money because he made money. He doesn't want to get taxed really bad on that. He doesn't want his friends from, the banking era to get, taxed on that kind of stuff. He wants people to get taxed on things that are, again, sort of finite. They own land, they own property, and that is leading to a massive concentration of wealth that, cannot be touched in many ways. So that's what we're looking to tax. The thing is that while that's pragmatic and that's a reasonable solution that could actually happen, clearly, he just said this stuff happens in Texas. So clearly it can be done. It's just not sexy. It's not bringing people in. It doesn't sort of have the socialist communist message of the people of, eat the rich, tax the rich. Jeff Bezos is going to eat your kids. It's not nearly inflammatory enough. It's too reasonable to make a video out of all the time.
George it was an approach to life which actually had a brief but extraordinary success, popular success in the United States. The game of Monopoly is based on, it's trying to interest people in George's principles of extractive rent seeking, okay? And the basic principle of Henry George is that it's now, I'm going to qualify this. It's extremely free market and capitalistic with regard to the fruits of your labor. Okay, anything you do, anything you build on your land is yours to keep. But it's effectively highly socialistic in terms of land ownership and arguably ownership of limited resources. So a Georgist would also tax oil, for example. Anything that's, and the argument is you didn't make those things. Would have been in the 19th century, they would have said, this is God's creation and you're only, you don't own it because you didn't make it. You don't have the right to own this thing because you didn't make it. What you are is a custodian of it and you pay commensurate tax on the land you own. Okay. Whereas you would in purist Georgia circles, you have no income tax at all. Okay. That's probably a bit extreme.
I like it.
But it's sometimes called geoism, and it's there's also a school of thought which is kind of environmental Georgism, which is you tax the consumption or you tax anything where you rivalrously consume something of which more can't be made.
Right. Yep.
Okay. And what happens in Texas, quite interestingly, is all these Californians apparently move to Texas and they go, God, the land here is really cheap. Let's buy loads of it. And then 6 months later, they get hit with a massive tax bill for their land ownership. And they go, what the hell's going on here? We bought this land because it's cheap. And the Texans reply, that's why it's cheap.
That's exactly why
you pay 2.5% tax on it.
Did you ever look at that issue with fighter pilot seats that was designed for average?
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. So that's similar, that's analogous to Gary Stevenson. Have you had Gary on, by the way?
I haven't. He was supposed to come on in London a couple of months ago when we last had you on.
I hope he's out shoe shopping instead. I'm in advertising. Meet me halfway, Gary.
Yeah, well, there's an interesting...
If you want to redistribute wealth, it does help if rich people occasionally go out and buy something.
Yeah, there's an interesting there's an interesting debate going on about whether or not Gary Stevenson is basically thinly veiled performance art. That you've got this the get up,
There is a good reason to suspect that is the case. And again, I will say, I don't know if, he's putting on a voice. I don't know if he's doing anything, that he wouldn't otherwise be doing. But I will say that he's very, if he is smart, and I think he is, he's doing this for a goal. I think his goal is power and influence via, a YouTube audience. And the celebrity that comes with that, and the parasocial relationship, and therefore he can say, hey, look, I've got 1 million people that are ravenously following my every move and whim. I can get them to vote for your party or my party or whatever, so what are you going to give me to get it? And maybe he says that and has great good intentions. I will say that's true of most people that get into politics. They at the very least think they have good intentions. Whether or not they'll have good results is, immaterial. But I will say the idea of him as performance art, as sort of like a put on, does not strike me as completely insane.
Same pair of joggers, all the rest of this stuff. It is, I don't know. It must be difficult to have.
I think he's okay. Apart from his consumption patterns, I think he's fundamental. So there are a few things where the problem with all these models is that the assumptions of the model that are necessary to simplify the model eventually come back to bite you. And looking at average wealth as if it's somehow representative of that a successful
mean and variance is not the same
getting
thing.
richer on average. The fact that for 30 fucking years in the US and the UK, we presented rising property prices as a good news story is monstrous. I mean, that was just the most monstrous misrepresentation of information. You don't say gasoline's gone up, but good news, you got a full tank of petrol, so your car's not now more valuable.
Fantastic example. Fantastic. Absolutely wonderful example.
Right.
Is it a case of kind of a luxury belief that the sort of people who would be writing and consuming those and understanding those sorts of stories are likely to already be people who own property?
Yeah.
So their lesson is not going to be, holy fuck, it's going to be hard to get onto them.
Yeah, absolutely true. Even worse, of course, every single MP in London throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s was basically heavily invested in the property market because they got a massive perk. They got their mortgage paid on a London home. So there wasn't a single person there, with the possible exception of someone, was Ken Livingstone ever an MP? I'm not sure he was. But apart from a few very, very principled leftists, or possibly a couple of Georgists in the Conservative Party, it's a weird, by the way, it's a weird sort of philosophy because it's both left wing and right wing, and so it has its
at the same time.
Milton Friedman was a fan. So was God, I always forget her name. Married to Malcolm McLaren, the fashion designer, Vivienne Westwood. She was also a Georgist. Okay. You get Richard Nixon, Winston Churchill.
Wow.
It has its adherents
really
everywhere.
crosses the spectrum.
What happened in the model was that Adam Smith thought there were 3 sources of wealth creation, which was land, capital, and labour. And future generations of economists thought it's too complicated having 3 things because it makes the maths difficult. So we'll pretend that capital and land are the same thing, and they're not. Because capital is potentially limitless and you can create more of it. Yeah. Land is effectively an artificial bottleneck. It's a rent-seeking device.
Traveling should be...
Very good points. Again, this was why I wanted to watch this video and review it with you, because I think he makes some very good points. Again, we're kind of on the Gary's economics kick, so we're trying to find out more about him and just the general ecosystem in which he lives. I think this guy makes some great points, which say, hey, Gary Stevenson makes some great points about the wealth distribution of limited assets and how they should be taxed if you don't want, future generations to be unable to afford them. And these are things that they essentially have to be able to live in, especially in the UK, which I think most of his stuff is geared much more towards, as opposed to the West in general, the US specifically. These things are necessary. And if they are made unattainably expensive via the fact that there's too many people to consume them, or they're all tied up in the hands of a few wealthy individuals, then you basically leading to some sort of legitimate societal collapse, because we have to have these things. If we can't get them through legitimate means, we're going to have to use some sort of violent, aggressive means to get them. And we don't want that, because that is, civil war, societal collapse. It's bad news for everybody involved. So we want to avoid that at all costs. With that being said, thank you very much for your time and attention. Good luck in all your endeavors. Farewell for now.